Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery. I've just realised as I've sat down to film this that last week's video was a little bit different from my usual, and perhaps this one is as well. So if you want a regular midweek mystery, that will be up in 2 weeks time. Next week I have a true crime Q&A going up instead because I'm on holiday, so I'm giving myself a little break. But this week's case is actually a medical mystery for you. I've got the case of the toxic lady, Gloria Ramirez. At around 8:15 p.m. on the 19th of February 1994, 31-year-old Gloria Ramirez is wheeled into the emergency room. Gloria is conscious, but she's not entirely with it. It's taking her a while to respond to questions, and even then it's only with short, incoherent answers. Her breathing is shallow and rapid, and her blood pressure is plummeting. Her heart is beating out of control, which is something called tachycardia. Shortly after arriving at the emergency room, she actually passes out. Gloria had recently been diagnosed with the advanced stages of cervical cancer, so she was pretty ill. The medical staff leap into action and they start to use a variety of different drugs to sedate her. Obviously she's already passed out, but they want to keep her sedated. So they use diazepam and lorazepam to sedate her, and they also use lidocaine and beryllium to help control her tachycardia. Her breathing is declining really rapidly. She's in a really bad state. And so they start to use an amber bag. That's basically one of those plastic ovals attached to a mouthpiece which you squeeze with your hand, and it basically forces air into the lungs, similar to actual mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. But she showed no signs of improvement, and so they had to start defibrillation. In order to defibrillate her, they have to tear off Gloria's shirt, and it's at this point, as they take off her shirt, they notice that her entire body is covered in this oily sheen. She's got this thin layer of oil over her entire body. Others also noticed around this point a very strange odour coming from her mouth, something they could only describe as a fruity garlic smell, which is very specific. Nurse Susan Kane is the one to draw blood from Gloria, and as she's drawing the blood, she notices this very strong smell, something she described as ammonia-like, so potentially smelling like urine or really strong chemicals. When she passed the tube over to another nurse called Julie Gorczynski, Julie actually notices a lot of manila coloured crystals floating in the blood, something she'd never seen before. At this point, Susan Kane faints and she's wheeled away from the room, and Julie also starts to feel ill. She begins to feel nauseous, lightheaded, and so she says she's going to go sit at the nurses' station for a little bit. And as she sits at the nursing station, she actually faints. They wheel her away as well, and her breathing actually begins to struggle. She develops apnea, meaning that she was stopping breathing for seconds at a time. A third member of staff who was assisting with Gloria was respiratory therapist Maureen Welch, and Maureen also faints. She later said that when she came round, she was on the floor and she had no control over her limbs. She couldn't move them. At this point, the hospital realised that there's something pretty serious happening here. Lots of people who are having contact with Gloria are suddenly just fainting, and so they order the department to completely evacuate. In total, 23 hospital staff on the ward that night fall ill with at least one symptom, and 5 of them are so ill that they have to be hospitalised themselves. Julie Gorczynski was the most ill of the lot. She went on to spend 2 weeks in the intensive care unit, and she suffered from hepatitis, pancreatitis, and a vascular necrosis of the knee. The bone tissue in her knee literally started to die. Julie had to take months recovering from the ordeal, having to walk with a crutch for a really long time. And strangely enough, the female staff seemed a lot more affected by this than male staff. Although it's not to say the males were completely unaffected, they were, but it was the females who got the worst of it. Just before 9 p.m. on the 19th of February, after about 45 minutes of CPR and defibrillation, Gloria Ramirez is pronounced dead. Her body is placed in a sealed body bag, and experts arrive to clean up and help figure out what exactly has just happened. Because all of this has happened in the space of literally about 45 minutes. They haven't had time to act on anything by this point. By 11 p.m. that night, the Riverside County Hazardous Materials team arrive at the hospital. They're looking for any kind of toxic chemical, anything that could have caused this, and there was nothing there. The prospect of an autopsy on Gloria's body was kind of terrifying to medical staff. They had no idea what they were going to find or if they were going to fall ill themselves. They had to put on full hazmat suits to even enter the same room as Gloria's body, and they worked on it in a sealed chamber. After about 90 minutes, they return out of the chamber with sort of samples of blood, tissue, some for organs, and also air from the body bag. It takes several days for the results to finally come through, but when they come through, there's nothing interesting in there at all. There's nothing remarkable about Gloria's body. She had a blocked urinary tract, among other things, but a lot of these were just sort of put down to the fact that she had advanced stage cancer. There was nothing that would explain what she and everyone around her experienced. But they weren't completely satisfied with the result of this, so about 6 weeks after Gloria's death, a second autopsy takes place. The Forensic Science Centre near San Francisco agrees to take up Gloria's case, and so on the 25th of March, autopsy samples are shipped to the lab on dry ice. They plan to analyse all of the compounds in the blood, the bile, the tissue, and look closely at the organ. They basically wanted to find any kind of unusual compound or unusual gas. They also wanted to check for any strange gases emanating from the organs. They used high-tech equipment that weren't available everywhere to figure out every single compound that was in Gloria's system at the time she died. The particular tool they used for this was called the Computer-Guided Combined Gas Chromatograph Mass Spectrometer. I could waste time telling you exactly how this machine works, but to be honest, I didn't fully understand it myself, so I'm going to simplify it for you. So basically, you put the sample into the machine and it vaporizes, and eventually all of the chemicals that was in whatever they put into the machine separate, and you can identify the exact number of compounds that was in this sample. This meant they were able to tell that Gloria had a very high amount of drugs in her system when she died, both hospital and self-administered, which isn't surprising when you remember that she was in late-stage cancer. They found lidocaine, Tylenol, codeine and Tigan, which is an anti-nausea medication. Those ones were completely expected. They weren't unusual to find in her body at all. But there were also some more interesting discoveries as well. The first one was an unidentified amine, which was basically a derivative of ammonia. It probably would have explained the strong ammonia smell coming off of Gloria's blood. Although they're not entirely sure how this formed in her body, they think that it may have broken down in the Tigan that she was taking. And then a second strange discovery was Nicotinamide, which was a B vitamin, which is pretty crucial to human health apparently. But it's actually something that's really commonly mixed into methamphetamines to sort of increase their value. This kind of threw the scientists a little bit because it's strange that somebody like Gloria, who would have been in so much pain, would have had something like this in her system. And the third odd chemical was a chemical called dimethyl sulfone, which is called DMSO2. DMSO2 is a reaction product of dimethyl sulfoxide, which is DMSO. And DMSO is actually a solvent that is often used by cancer patients in an attempt to help them with the pain that they experience. It's a chemical solvent which is applied to the skin and it absorbs into the skin really quickly. It's been shown to reduce pain and inflammation in cancer patients, but it has no actual effect on the cancer itself. It's not going to cure you, it's just going to maybe help you feel better for a little bit. And so this could potentially explain the oily sheen on Gloria's skin. But DMSO is meant to absorb really quickly, so it's a little bit strange that it was actually still on her skin. But neither DMSO or DMSO2 are particularly dangerous drugs, and they wouldn't have caused the kind of symptoms that Gloria and everyone else had. On April 29th, a press conference was held to reveal the autopsy results. They said that Gloria had died of cardiac dysrhythmia triggered by kidney failure, which basically stemmed from her cervical cancer. For all intents and purposes, this was the end of the investigation into Gloria's death. But this didn't explain at all the effect that Gloria had on all the other members of staff. So the health department calls in 2 scientists to look further into what happened here. And unsurprisingly, they found that the people who suffered the worst symptoms were the people who were working closest with Gloria, and particularly the people who were handling her IV lines. On September 2nd, so many months ahead now, they released their official findings, and that is that the hospital staff had experienced an outbreak of mass sociogenic illness. It was basically a case of mass hysteria apparently. They said that once one person got ill, it just triggered a domino effect among the rest of the staff, and it was just all in their heads. But you've got to remember that you're talking about hospital staff here, people who see this kind of thing day in, day out. They're not going to be affected by witnessing one person fainting or one person throwing up. It just doesn't make sense. It also doesn't explain how Julie Gorczynski literally had dying flesh in her knee. Her knee essentially was dying. That's a very physical symptom of something which they just brushed off as being mass hysteria. Julie actually ended up filing a lawsuit against Riverside General Hospital and the coroner's office and just anyone who was pretty much involved in this whole thing, and she was seeking $6 million in damages. But to be honest, I couldn't find out if she actually won the lawsuit or not. I kind of hope she did. But although the case was pretty much closed at this point, the scientists continued to read up on Gloria's case, just out of scientific curiosity more than anything, and they come across a substance called dimethyl sulfate. Dimethyl sulfate was a poisonous gas which could give people a variety of different symptoms, but symptoms which are very close to the symptoms that the hospital staff had. Dimethyl sulfate, in very layman's terms, is basically caused when 2 atoms of oxygen is added to DMSO2. So just add a little bit of oxygen and suddenly you've got this poisonous gas. So the general theory here is that when Gloria came into the ER, she was dosed up on DMSO, which is what caused the oily sheen all over her skin. But her urinary tract was all blocked up and her kidneys weren't working properly, meaning that the DMSO was just building up in her system. When the oxygen is administered to Gloria, it's likely that at this point it became DMSO2, which is when there's just 1 atom of oxygen, which is fine. That's still not dangerous. But this could have potentially explained the crystals in her blood. When DMSO2 cools to room temperature, it can crystallise sometimes. This explains almost everything, but it doesn't explain how the DMSO2 turns into dimethyl sulfate, the poisonous gas. And this is something that they're still not sure on. This is their favourite theory, the DMSO theory, but they still cannot say for sure how the gas actually ended up in her system. They theorise that perhaps the defibrillation shocks caused some kind of like electric reaction and it turned into the gas, but they don't know. But it does make sense that this gas wouldn't be found in an autopsy because it disappears as fast as it forms. Although this theory does sound like the most likely option and some of it does add together, it's never been confirmed. It's a strong theory at best. Most of the symptoms of the hospital staff did match the gas theory, even Julie's hepatitis, but strangely it didn't match the most common complaint of the staff, the nausea and the vomiting. That's never been proven to be a direct symptom of dimethyl sulfate. And there's also questions as to whether the gas could have formed in the cool temperatures of the body. Usually it requires much hotter temperatures to form. Gloria's body was released to her family 2 months after her death, and her family basically didn't believe that the first 2 autopsies were the correct answer. They didn't trust them at all, and so they hired an independent pathologist to do a 3rd autopsy on Gloria's body. But this pathologist was completely unable to determine any cause whatsoever, but for a different reason. Gloria's heart was missing, it wasn't put back in her body, and the rest of her organs were all cross-contaminated with fecal matter. Just in general, her body was way too badly decomposed to tell anything. Clearly her body was being stored incorrectly at the previous facility, so what does that say about the original autopsy? But on April 20th, 1994, Gloria is finally buried. I feel like I wouldn't be telling you the whole story if I didn't tell you one of the most popular theories in this case, even though a lot of people just dismiss it as complete rubbish. But I did mention earlier that Nicotinamide was actually the 2nd strange compound that they found in Gloria's system, and that's the drug that is commonly mixed with methamphetamines. Now, seeing as Riverside County was one of the largest methamphetamine distribution points in the US around this time, the theory basically says that the hospital was involved in this. People were potentially smuggling the precursor chemical drugs, the chemicals that are used to make meth, into the hospital in IV bags. And the theory basically says that somebody accidentally administered one of these IV bags to Gloria instead of an actual IV. And this could have explained the strong ammonia smell coming from Gloria's blood as well. Apparently the general smells and symptoms that were seen in this case are pretty similar to those of meth fume exposure. But it's worth saying, like I said earlier, the hazmat team did come in and they basically turned the entire hospital upside down, and they found nothing to point to some secret meth lab in the hospital or being some meth distribution point. They didn't see anything. Generally, I think the DMSO theory is pretty strong, but there are definitely still questions. How did it become so toxic? How did it form? What caused the fruity garlic smell on Gloria's breath? That hasn't been answered by any of these. I know that diabetics can sometimes have quite a strong fruity smell on their breath when they're suffering from ketoacidosis, so I wonder if they ever explored that avenue. I'm sure they did, and it didn't come to anything, but it's just an interesting point to make. If this was something that happened to Gloria after using DMSO, how come it isn't something that we see more often? How come there hasn't been more reports of things like this happening? A lot of people also theorise that Gloria was radioactive when she entered the hospital, but to be honest, we know very little about Gloria's actual life. All we know is that she had cancer and that she became the toxic lady. We don't actually know anything about her home life, so I can't really theorise as to how she would have come into contact with the radioactive material, although a lot of the symptoms are consistent with exposure to radiation. And that is the case of Gloria Ramirez. I thought I'd do something a little bit different with a medical mystery this week. I found it really interesting, so I hope you guys did as well. If you enjoyed this, please make sure you give it a thumbs up and let me know what other cases you want me to cover down below. Any other medical mysteries that you think could be interesting for me to talk about, let me know. And I'll see you in a couple of weeks' time, or I'll see you next week. It just won't be a mystery. Okay, bye guys.